So working on the leaves for this type of a tree, you can use a bunch of different types of branches. You can use a bunch of different colors. I'm going to kind of stick with my soft brush and stick with my blues and my greens. You can absolutely use more fall colors and use reds and oranges in there, which I have done on the other example, and I will show you that. But then on this example, I'm going to start in with some of my blue areas, which are more on this side, and then there's some yellow up here. So what I'm going to do is wherever I have yellow and wherever I have white spaces, I'm not going to paint anything right now. And I'm just going to kind of scribble around where I see those leaves going, especially the darker area ones. And they're just kind of blobs right now. And then I'm going to go ahead and start adding some green. Again, still leaving the areas where I have the yellows and the whites alone. Remember, you can add more water, you can add less water. The amount of water you use will affect the value, which will in turn affect the depth. You can also still lift as you are working on these. You can also use texture, you can use salt, you can use the white pastel. These are kind of like clouds, so you will want some areas where you're going to lift kind of as you go. So this side has more green and some yellow. So I'm just going to lighten some of these areas to make them a little bit more the value that they need to be. Still working primarily with my green and using the blue a little bit as needed. But I have not started in with my yellow yet because it's a highlight. So it would be a little bit more towards the very end. Notice too that I'm not like pinpointing exact branches. I'm just kind of painting directly over the branches. If you put all of your leaves around the branches to try to make it look like they are on certain branches, it's actually going to have the opposite effect. And it will make your painting look a lot flatter. So you can get more detail of the leaves in there by dabbing with your brush a little bit even more than I am. Because if you dry up your brush and stick it on there, it's going to lift some of that color. And each time you do, you're kind of creating a highlight and allowing the shadows to become where you have those darker values. So here, for instance, if I wanted to really make some of this a lot lighter, I could dry my brush a lot and dab it in there and lift that up, and it's going to kind of create a leaf shape. I could also go in with my paper towel and literally just stick that on there as we've done with previous things. So now I am going to go ahead and use a little bit of my yellow. I'm not going to make it super dark, so I do want to put a lot of water in that yellow, and then I'm just going to look and see where it needs to be right now. It's going to lift up some of the other colors that are there, and that's perfectly fine because once again, the yellow is a highlight. So if your first little bit of yellow ends up a little bit whiter than you want, kind of like how some of these areas are, because you're lifting the color under, that's absolutely fine. Don't fret, don't panic, because as usual, everything is going to happen in layers. We're not going to do all of our tree at once. We're not going to do all the shading at once. Everything builds up in layers. And I'm still going to be lifting kind of as I go. Maybe adding a little bits of green in that yellow. And allowing my edges, especially toward the top and sort of the back side of the tree, to be really soft. There is a little more green here. So now parts of my tree are drier, so when I go back in with more pigment, it doesn't blend as much and it stays a little more solid. which, if you're careful, you can use that to your advantage. If you aren't aware that that is going to happen, it can sometimes mess you up. So just make sure that you are careful as you add more colors to things when they are still wet. So that might be my first layer in terms of the leaves on that tree. It is not done. There's a lot over here that still needs to be done, but it's sort of a soft bluish green. So I think I'm going to let these areas dry first and then lighten up as I move back with my yellowish green there. So then the other thing I want to do is just show you some more layers on top of this particular tree example. And I will be honest, I don't have a reference image pulled up for this one. So I'm just going to be kind of using the same one that I was just using, but I'll be using different colors because I've got more fall colors on this tree. So I'm going to start in there with some red. And it's going to be a very similar concept. I'm going to be putting it primarily where I have those darker colors first. Move my paint over so I can reach better. Maybe go in with some of that golden yellow color. A little bit of blue. Because what the blue is going to do is kind of create a dark purpley color, which is going to make some of those areas look like they are obviously shadows. And then there will still be some green in there. And again, I'm going to kind of lift as I go. Remember that you do not need a second layer on the whole tree. Okay? Each subsequent layer that you do, especially on things like trees, is going to become smaller and smaller. So that as you build up those layers, all you're really doing is adding the detail layers on top of sort of a background layer. You pretty much never will repaint the entire thing and cover up what you've already done. The second layer is usually intended to just enhance that first layer by adding more detail, by adding more depth and value and things like that, not necessarily to cover it up. Put a little bit of orange in there. So there are some sort of darker spaces up here. So I want to make sure I get that in there. And if you don't like that, like say I don't like that orange, I could just paint more water over it and then just dab it up and it will mostly come right up as long as you do it right away. So then let's continue to work a little bit here. Let's say I need to make an area lighter, like say there's a really bright highlight here that I missed. I'm just going to scrub that with my brush and with some plain water. And then just dab that up with a paper towel, and it will lighten up there. So now I can also work in here with some smaller brushes to get some more of those individual leaves, especially towards the bottom if I want to really create a deep shadow on the underside of that tree. So you see now that that shadow is starting to look like it's much darker than the rest of the tree and is starting to give it a little more depth and some volume there. And then I still do want to dry my brush off as I blend that into the rest of the tree in areas. Because some areas, just like when we were working with the clouds, you want it to be more of a solid line sort of stop. And then other areas, you want there to be a softer transition. Most of the time when you're shading, you will have a combination of soft and solid transitions. And I know that that sounds a little bit counterintuitive. But there are certain areas that you are going to want to make sure that you can definitely see where one value starts and stops, and then other times where you will not want to see that. So then that might be an example of adding some more layers and things like that to this particular tree. It will not necessarily be finished yet. You could absolutely still lighten certain things. You could add branches, you could add leaves. The big thing is to make sure that you are looking at your reference image and using that as a guide for how much color you need, how much value you need, the size of the tree, the size of the branches, different things like that. So here I'm going to put a little more yellow up here at the top and let it kind of go off the page because it does seem a little squished. But then that's also going to lift some of my other color and lighten it a bit, and that's perfectly fine. So that would be still not a necessarily finished tree, but now it looks like there's some light kind of coming through those leaves a little bit up towards the top. So now you've seen a little bit of how to make some different types of trees. You've seen the first and second layers on a couple of them. Now if I wanted to go back into my evergreen there in the middle, just really quickly with a little more green because it is still a little bit wet, I would basically just repeat the exact same sort of scribble motion, but now I might focus it primarily on where the darker green needs to be. So like if the darker green is mostly over here, I'm going to focus a little bit more on putting more of that green on this side. It will still venture into the other side a little bit. So now that's starting to get a shadow specifically on one side, and then once it dries the rest of the way, I could go back in and lighten a little bit as needed.